Welcome to the PHP Essential Training Series. In this tutorial, we're going to demonstrate how to read text from a text file using PHP and then display that text in our browser window. So in this tutorial, we're going to walk through the steps required to read from a text file using PHP and then display the information that we read from that file in our browser window. And the steps that we're going to follow while we go through this procedure are: first, we're going to discuss the directory structure. Then we're going to create the text file itself that we're going to actually read from. We're going to assemble and discuss the PHP code, the code that's actually required to read that text file. And then we're going to demonstrate using that PHP code inside of our browser and reading from that text file and displaying it into an HTML document. So let's discuss the directory structure. Alright, so before we get started, let's go ahead and discuss the directory structure that we're going to use for this particular tutorial. And what we're going to do here is we're going to actually point out the root directory of the Wimp server. If you'll remember correctly, we've created a Wimp server for all our testing and development as we work through our different tutorials, both in HTML, CSS, PHP, and MySQL. So you should be working on your Wimp server right now, and the Wimp server, as we walk through this tutorial, should be running. We're going to create a new directory for the text file inside of our root directory on our Wimp server. And then we're going to explain the relationship and how that works in regards to our directory that we've just created. So let's go ahead and look at, first thing I want to bring up is the directory structure of the Wimp server. I'm going to go ahead and minimize our screen here for our PowerPoint. You'll notice I'm in the C Programs directory inside my Wimp folder, and the www directory is where we store all the files that we're working on as we develop our website. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that folder. Inside there, I've obviously got a tutorials folder because I'll be doing a bunch of different types of tutorials on the website. So I'm going to have these broken down into sections. In my PHP section right now, I have nothing in there, but this is where I'm going to create my data folder that's going to hold this text file. So I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it data and hit my enter key. So I've created a folder now that's going to store my text file for this demonstration, this tutorial demonstration. So keep in mind, now we're in the www directory. On your computer it should be www, and then inside that directory we'll have this data folder. So let me go ahead and just demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about there. So what you should have created is you've got your root directory for your Wimp server, which is the www directory. Off that root directory, we've just created another folder called data. That's where we're going to store our text file. In the root of the Wimp server, we're going to have a file called reading from a text file.php. That's the actual file we're going to create in the tutorial that's going to read from that text file that we're going to create. And then inside that data folder, we're going to create another document called levels.txt, which is going to actually store the data that we're going to read with our PHP file. So this should be the structure when we finish the tutorial that you have built on your website. We've got our root directory, our root file, our data directory, and the file that we're going to read inside that data directory. Keep in mind, you don't have to have these buried in directories. I do this for organization outside my website. You could have everything in the root directory, in which case you wouldn't have to have the paths that we're going to talk about as we go through the tutorial. I like to demonstrate these paths because most people that design websites will use path structures to keep their site more organized. Okay, so now we've created that structure for our tutorial. Let's go ahead and create that text file. That'll be our next step. Alright, so now we're going to go in and we're actually going to create that text file that we're going to read from. So let's go through the steps that we're going to need to do that. First thing we're going to do, we're going to discuss the text tool that we're going to use, which is going to be Notepad++. We'll briefly discuss why we need a text editor. If you've actually watched the tools tutorials on the tools section of the website, you'll understand why, because I actually have a tutorial in there that goes through a bunch of different text editors and what's available out there, why we use a text editor, why it's needed, and why we can't use things like a word processor. We're going to actually create the file and store it in that data directory that we just created. And inside that file, we're going to create some user access levels called super user, administrator, staff, user, and guest. And that's the actual data that we're going to read from that text file into our PHP program, which will be displayed in our browser. So let's go ahead and open up our text editor. And again, I'm using Notepad++ is going to be the text editor that I'm going to use for this particular demonstration. And all I want to do in here is I'm going to type in superuser, hit my enter key. I'm going to type in administrator. Of course, I'm going to type it in correctly and spelling it correctly. I'm going to type in staff. Now we're going to type in user, and we're going to type in guest. And I'm going to save this. I want to save this inside that directory we just created, that data directory we just created inside of our Wimp folder. So I'm going to go to Wimp, www, inside my PHP tutorials, inside my data directory, and I want to call this levels.txt. You can name this whatever you want to name it. I'm just naming it levels because basically it tells me what I've got stored in this text file. I'm going to name this levels.txt, make certain I'm storing this as a normal text file, and hit my save. And now we've got our text file created that we're actually going to use to read from our PHP application. So the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to start, let me go ahead and minimize this. Let's go back in to our presentation, because the next step is we're going to start creating our PHP code and putting everything together so we can actually read that text file. Alright, so now we're going to go in and we're going to create that PHP code that allows us to go in and read that text file that we just created and display it in our browser. So I'm going to go ahead and load up my browser. I like using this split screen effect, by the way, when I'm doing tutorials. It allows you to see my browser window. And currently I'm running Firefox and my text editor, and for this particular tutorial I'm going to be using Sublime Text 2. So you can see them side by side. As we're making changes, you'll be able to see them reflected in the browser. First thing I want to point out is your Wimp server should be running. You should have a green icon in your taskbar telling you that your Wimp server is running. I've actually got this in the root directory of my Wimp server. Keep in mind, yours will probably be in the www directory. I'm going to go inside that PHP tutorial directory, and this is the data folder that we just created. This is where we actually stored that levels.txt file. So this will be our root directory for a particular application that we're writing for this particular tutorial. So I'm going to go ahead in my Sublime Text 2. I'm going to tell it I want a new document so that you don't have to watch me type everything. I'm going to go ahead and paste in my basic HTML code that I need to start out my basic Html5 document. This way you don't have to see it typed individually. I'll talk about this really quick. This is an HTML5 doc type, and you'll see that at the top of our screen. We're going to save this as a PHP file because we're going to have PHP code inside of this file. Inside my head, I've got the title for the document, reading from a text file. Could actually put in there reading from a text file using PHP, but we didn't. And I've got an H3 heading in my body called reading from a text file. And here I think I will put in using PHP. And now I'm going to save this document inside this PHP directory. So I'm going to do save as. I want to go to my Wimp server. Keep in mind now we're going to put this on the server so we can actually see this and see what we're doing as we're developing this tutorial. And I'm going to call this reading data from a PHP, from a text file. .php. You can name this whatever you want. This just keeps it so I understand what I did with this particular tutorial. So I'm going to have this as reading data from a text file using PHP. I'm going to click save. I'm going to make sure that it's in my root directory where that data folder is. I'm going to click the save. If I go ahead and refresh this, by the way, you should now see that we've got that PHP file located in that root directory. This is kind of why I like having these things side by side. Real quick, let's talk about this. Standard HTML5 document. I've got my doc type HTML head. Then I have my HTML opening and closing tags. My head tags, which holds all the head information of my document. You'll notice if I load this document up, which I will in a minute, this will be the actual title of our document that's going to go across the tab. And in my body, I've got an H3 heading that says reading from a text file using PHP. So now if I go ahead and click on this document to load it up, you'll notice now we've got our title tag, reading from a text file, right there fills out our tab, and then reading a text file using PHP is the H3 header in our body tag. Next, we're going to start building the PHP code that's going to go ahead and read that text file. Okay, so we've got our basic structure built. So now the first thing we want to do is we want to come right below this H3 tag. Let's go ahead and put in our opening and closing PHP tags. Drop down a couple lines and put in our closing tag. So everything that's going to go in between these two tags will be the PHP code that we're going to use to go in and actually read this text document. So the first thing I want to do here is I actually want to build a path that tells the HTML page, or the PHP page in this particular instance, where that text file is located. So I'm going to come down from my opening tag. I'm going to tab in because we want to keep good construction inside my document. And I'm going to create a variable called document root. And this variable is going to store the actual document root of our server inside this variable name. And we actually have a global variable in PHP that does that, and it's called our server variable, or server global variable. So it's $_server, my square brackets, single quotes, and then I'm going to put in document root. This actually stores the root of our web server. So now we've got that portion already in there. I ended that with a semicolon. The next thing I want to end, and so you don't have to watch me type this, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this in and put it in there for you, is I want to put the actual path to that data folder. Now keep in mind a couple things going on here. Let me go ahead and save this. I'm not in the root directory because I've got these tutorial directories set up, so yours is not going to be near this complex. From my root, I've got to go into tutorials, then /PHP, then I'm in the data folder. And you'll actually see that if you look up here. From my document root, or from my web root, I have a tutorials directory, a PHP directory, and then I'm going to have that data directory. So I'm going to go back so you can actually see that. There's the data directory that we're trying to target right there. And you'll see that my document root is right here. That's the www directory, but I've got to go through the tutorials in PHP, and that's what I'm spelling out. This $= is building on to this variable. So what I'm doing is I'm appending to it. I've got my document root, my www directory set up in the first line, and now I'm saying, okay, now from there, I want you to build onto that, or I want you to concatenate to that a tutorials /PHP /data directory, and that will get me inside that directory right there. And that's what we've done by adding that particular line. So now we're to the actual folder, but what I want to do now is I actually want to go in and load that levels text file. So right below that, I'm going to create a new variable called file name, and I'm going to say the file name is equal to the document root dot, so in other words, I'm concatenating again, and inside single quotes, levels.txt. Remember, that's the name that we gave our file, level.txt. Let's go ahead and save this. So I'm concatenating, and again, what concatenation is, I'm appending. I'm taking my document root variable, remember that's the one we've created up here with these two lines, and right now that document root variable is everything up to the data directory. And I'm saying take that variable and add on level.txt to the end of it. And that's going to give me the file name. So this file name variable equals all of this. Let's go ahead and save this, and I'll show you what I mean by that. It equals that entire path. But before I show you that, let me do one other thing. I want to add one more line to this. So I'm going to say right below that, I want to know how many lines are in this file. So I'm going to create another variable called lines in file equal, count is a built-in function in PHP. I want to go in and look at the file with the name file name and count how many lines are in that actual file. And you're going to see in a minute why I want that. But before we move on, let's go ahead and save this file, because there's a couple things I want to do here. As I write PHP files, I tend to test them or check them as we work our way through them. So right now, because I've got two variables created, I've got a file name variable that should be the entire path to my text document, and I've got a lines in file variable created that should count how many lines are in that text document. Let's go ahead and test and see if they're working. So what I want to do is I'm actually going to put in a little debug statement in here, and in fact I'm going to add it down below. So I'm going to add another PHP section. I tend to do this a lot when I'm actually building PHP applications. And I'm going to say, okay, I want to come in there. I want to print with a line break, list the file name. So I'm going to go up and print this file name variable out to my web browser so I can see what the entire path is. So I've just basically said, okay, I want a line break, list the file name. This is going to be displayed on the screen, enclosed in quotation marks, and then I'm going to concatenate onto that variable. So I want to list this on my screen so I can see what it is. And one other thing I want to do, let's go ahead and get the number of lines that are in that actual file. Since we've created that variable, let's go ahead and print those lines out on the screen so you can see that, yeah, we actually are reading that text file. So we're going to list the number of lines that are in the file. And again, because we're printing this to our screen, I've got a line break, so I got a separate line. It tells me what I'm looking for, lists the number of lines in the file, and then I'm going to display that variable, list of lines in file. So it should tell me what that particular count is. Let's go ahead and save this, because we're nowhere near done with this code yet, but we're at a point where we can actually test what we've done. Let's go back to our parent directory inside of our browser window, and let's click on this reading data from a text file.php, and it should tell me the complete path. So list my file name is C. It's in my Wimp root directory, tutorials PHP, data, level.txt, and it's telling me that the number of lines in that file are 5. If you remember from when we actually created that text file, we actually had 5 lines in that file. If you'll remember correctly, in fact, we could actually go back into our root directory and look at that file. So let's go back into our PHP directory. Let's go in here. Let's see if we can open this thing with, we'll just open it with WordPad. And you'll see that we have 5 lines in that particular file. Let's close this up a little bit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's the number of lines that we're displaying right there. So we are reading our text file. That's pretty cool. So we know that our code up to this point is working. We've got a lot more code to add, but we've got our full path that gets me to my text file, and now we know how many lines are in it. And you'll see why the line count is important as we move into the next section of the tutorial. Okay, pretty cool. So you've seen what we've gotten so far. We've actually gotten to our text file that's in our data directory. We've actually read the file. We know that we've read it correctly because we've got the number of lines displayed correctly. Now let's go pull that data out so we can actually display that in our browser window. So I'm going to come down and skip a line. And the next thing I want to do is I want to create a new variable called FP. And that FP variable, as you're going to see in a minute, is going to store my fopen command, where it's going to go actually in and read this file name, and it's going to open that file for reading only. So my FP variable equals fopen, which is a built-in function in PHP. And in that built-in function, I've got to pass it in 2 attributes. I've got to pass it in the file that I want to open. In this case, it's the level.txt file. Remember, that's our file name variable. And I have to tell it that I'm opening this file up for reading only. And in single quotes, I'm going to put that small r right there to tell PHP to go ahead and open that file, but open it up for read only. So now we've got the file open. And now what I need to do is I need to build a for loop. So I'm going to come in here right below this, and I'm going to build my for loop, and hopefully you've watched some of the tutorials on for loops and how they work. But I need a for loop to actually display what I want to do in here, so let's go ahead and put that for loop in, and we'll discuss what that for loop does. So let's discuss what we're doing here. So I create my for loop, and I'm creating a variable inside the for loop called I, and I'm saying I is equal to 1. Because right now I doesn't exist, so we create it, we make it equal to 1. And I say if I is less than or equal to the lines in the file. So there's why we needed this particular variable we talked about right there. Because inside my for loop, I'm checking to see is I equal to or less than lines in file. Because if it is, it's going to execute this code. If it's not, it's going to drop out of that for loop, and then the for loop's complete. So if it is less than that, we're going to execute the code. And then the first thing I'm going to do is say, okay, line equal, I'm going to create a variable called line. and I'm going to say it equals the fgets fp command. Okay, fgets is a built-in function in PHP again that gets a single line from my file. And it's going to take this fp that we opened. Remember, we opened this up for file name reading only. It's going to pull a single line from that fp variable. So it's going to read a single line. I'm going to create another variable called level, and I'm going to trim any white space off of that text that I may have when I created that text file. So if I had any white space preceding the text data, or if I had any white space after the text data, this built-in function in PHP called trim is going to trim out that white space, and it's going to give me back that data inside the level variable. And then right below that, I'm going to say, okay, print the user level. Take this value that's inside that variable. Remember, each time it goes through there, it's going to be a different line of data because we're only getting one line at a time. It's going to display that on the screen. It's going to give me a line feed, in other words, a line break, to create a new line, and it's going to go back up and run this for loop again. It's going to continue to run the for loop until this I variable is greater than the lines in the file. So as long as the I variable is less than or equal to lines in file, which we know right now lines in file is 5, as long as it's less than 5, it's going to run through this code, pulling out each individual line, trimming out the white space on each individual line, and then printing the user level on the browser window screen. As soon as it exceeds the lines in the file, it drops out, it ends the for loop, and then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to actually close it with another PHP function called fpclose, and I'm going to close that file name that I had open for read only. So once my for loop is complete, it's going to close out that fp variable, close the file name, and exit out of the PHP script. One other thing I want to do, I'm going to go ahead and leave this debug stuff on here, but I'm going to add a couple more things to this. And again, I only do this because as I'm writing the code, this is how I troubleshoot when I'm writing, so I make sure I'm getting all my stuff in. This just tells me this is a little group of PHP to trace these variables. Make sure we're doing the right thing. I'm going to go ahead and save this file because right now we've got all the code we need now to read from that text file. So I'm going to go ahead and read from the text file and display those values inside the text file on our screen. In order to do that, I'm just going to go ahead back here and I'm going to refresh my browser window. Boom. By refreshing the browser window, I reloaded my reading data from a text file in PHP, and you'll notice it goes in and tells me my user level. The first time I passed through was super user. The second time I passed through is administrator, staff, user, and guest. And if you remember correctly, those are the values that we actually had in our data file. So let's go in and make a change and see how well our application's working. Okay, so we've got all of our stuff loaded in now. We've actually read our text file. Let's go ahead and make a change to that text file so you can see the advantages to actually reading files like this. Keep in mind, this is a very small file. A lot of times we do this for very large files, or I'd actually do this to build select lists inside of an HTML document where I can actually update a text file and not have to go in and touch my HTML code. Let's go ahead and just add a couple things to this. I'm going to say we have a super user 2 user. So we're going to say we have a super user 2. And let's say we have a staff 2 user, because we're actually adding a lot more stuff to our website. And we have a staff 3 user. So there's different levels of the staff users. There are different levels of the super users. I go ahead and save this. Again, saving it back to that levels.txt file inside of our data directory. You'll see there's our path right there. Now if I go ahead and update this HTML form, or this PHP form that we're reading in the HTML document, you'll notice now, again, we've walked through, we've updated our list because we're reading that file dynamically. We've updated the lines in our file. We've updated the list that we're displaying on the screen. So you can see we're actually reading from that text file. Very, very cool feature of PHP, something I use a lot when I'm not working with dynamic sites. A lot of times if I'm working with really big sites, I'll be doing this in SQL, but this is one way of doing it using a data file, a plain text data file. Do keep in mind, if you're going to put this on your site, you want to get rid of this code that we're using for debug. This is basically for our benefit, not for anyone else. You wouldn't want to put this up on your site where you're tracing these variables out in a debug site. You'd actually go pull this off. In fact, what we'll do, hang on, let's do a save. Then I'm going to pull this out and do a save as. And we'll just call this _1. And again, we're saving it as a PHP file because we've got PHP code in it. I go back to my local host. And now instead of loading the original, we're going to load that one, and you'll see we get up all our lists and stuff, but we've kept that PHP code out, our troubleshooting code or our debugging code out of our document, which is what we'd want to do if we were actually moving this to our website. If you purchase the tutorial, you'll have copies or access to all the exercise files. You'll see a start and a finish file for the PHP code. You'll also have a copy of the text file that we created, and you'll have a full text document with a copy of all the different code that we used throughout the demonstration. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you in the next one.